Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today we explain Exodus chapter 17 in a clear and simple way, step by step. We're stepping into a chapter that is just defined by sheer desperation. We're talking about a life or death water crisis, a literal near mutiny against Moses, and then, out of nowhere, a sudden unprovoked desert war. We are going to walk through the original Hebrew text together, looking purely at the simple meaning, what we call the Peshat. We want to understand exactly what happens verse by verse in this incredibly action-packed chapter.
Here's our agenda for today. First, context and the hook. 2, thirst at Rephidim. 3, water from the rock. 4, the battle against Amalek. 5, key ideas and lessons. And finally, a chapter recap and conclusion. And I want to reassure you right up front, this explainer is going to provide a highly organized chronological walkthrough of the text, mapping out our journey together step by step so you won't miss a thing.
Okay, let's dive into this. Looking right at verse 1, the entire congregation of the children of Israel is journeying from the wilderness of sin. Now, the text specifically tells us they're traveling by their stages, which means they are moving step by step exactly according to the strict commandment of the Lord. So they aren't just wandering aimlessly out there, they're following divine coordinates. Finally, they pitch their camp in a place called Rephidim. But almost immediately, they hit this massive, life-threatening roadblock. There's absolutely no water for the people to drink. Imagine the sheer scale of this for a second. You have hundreds of thousands of people, plus all their livestock, baking in the arid heat of the desert, and the one resource they desperately need to survive is just nowhere to be found. Section 1. Thirst at Rephidim. The reality of their situation is just incredibly desperate, and we see this right away in verses 2 and 3. You've got this massive population stranded in an unforgiving wilderness. Thirst takes over, and pure, unfiltered panic completely sets in. The text tells us the people literally strove or quarreled with Moses. They angrily demand, "Give us water that we may drink." And Moses replies, "Why do you strive with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But honestly, the situation escalates so fast. In verse 3, the people murmur against Moses, and they make this incredibly harsh, cynical accusation. They say, "Wherefore hast thou brought us up out of Egypt, to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst?" They are genuinely terrified. In their minds, they've gone from being miraculously freed slaves to doomed victims, about to die right there in the sand. And this quote right here from verse 4 really captures the severe tension in the camp. Faced with a furious, terrified, and thirsty crowd, Moses realizes he has completely lost control of the mob. The verse says Moses cries out to the Lord. He says, "What shall I do unto this people? They are almost ready to stone me." Think about that. This isn't just a mild complaint about the stress of leadership. This is a severe, life-threatening emergency. We are seeing Moses' real human fear here. He is facing an imminent mutiny, and his immediate, desperate instinct is to turn to God for a solution before those rocks start flying and things turn irreversibly violent. Section 2. Water from the rock. Well, God doesn't leave his leader hanging. In verses 5 and 6, the Lord gives Moses a very precise, step-by-step command to solve this massive problem. First, he tells Moses to pass on before the people. Then, he's supposed to take the elders of Israel with him to act as official witnesses. Now, why the elders? Because God wants the respected leaders to witness the miracle firsthand, so they can validate it to the rest of the doubting, angry camp. Next, Moses has to take his rod, and the text makes a point to remind us this is specifically the very same rod he used to strike the river Nile back in Egypt. God tells Moses, "Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink." So Moses follows these steps exactly. He strikes the rock right in the sight of the elders, the water flows, and he literally saves the nation. But here's the thing. The physical resolution of getting water isn't actually the end of the story. Verse 7 reveals the deeper spiritual issue at play here. The core problem wasn't just their physical thirst. It was this pivotal, doubtful question that the people were asking in their hearts. They were asking, "Is the Lord among us or not?" I really want to let that sink in for a second. These are people who had just seen the plagues in Egypt. They literally walked through the parted sea. Yet the second they were terrified and thirsty, they questioned God's very presence and protection. They took a physical trial in a harsh desert and turned it into a direct, rebellious test of God. And because of this massive failure of faith, Moses actually permanently renames the location in the first half of verse 7. He calls the place Massah, which in simple English means trying or testing. It gets this name specifically because the children of Israel tried or tested the Lord with their profound doubt.
They demanded immediate proof of his presence, instead of just trusting the guidance that had already brought them safely this far.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the location also gets a second name, Meribah. Meribah translates simply to strife or quarreling. This shows us exactly how the physical location in the desert was permanently marked by their emotional striving against Moses. So Massah and Meribah forever stand in the text as geographical reminders of the day the Israelites quarreled with their leader and tested God's presence. It permanently links the physical landscape to their moment of highest desperation and lowest faith. Section 3. The battle against Amalek. So with their thirst finally quenched, you'd probably think the camp could just get some rest, right? But no. Verse 8 starts with a sudden, really jarring shift. It says, "Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim." Literally out of nowhere, an unprovoked physical threat emerges. Amalek, who are historically understood as descendants of Esau, arrives and launches a predatory war against the Israelites. And notice where this happens. They attack the exact same location where the Israelites had just been struggling with their own internal strife. This is an absolutely crucial detail to understand. Amalek wasn't fighting for territory or defending themselves. They deliberately attacked a vulnerable, completely exhausted people who had just barely survived a life-threatening water crisis. Faced with this sudden war, Moses immediately enacts a very clear battle strategy, which we see detailed in verses 9 through 12. Step 1. Moses commands Joshua to choose out men and go down into the valley to fight Amalek. By the way, this is the very first time Joshua is ever mentioned in the text, stepping right up as the military commander. Step 2. Moses himself takes on a spiritual vantage point. He declares that tomorrow he will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in his hand. And step 3. Moses knows for a fact he can't hold this line all by himself, so he takes Aaron and a man named Hur with him to the hilltop to provide some absolutely essential support. What happens next in verse 11 is just a fascinating dynamic between the physical battle raging down in the valley and the spiritual posture up on the hill. As Joshua fights down below, the tide of the entire battle is entirely dictated by Moses' actions above. The text says that when Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But, human strength has strict limits. The physical toll on Moses was immense. His arms grew incredibly heavy, and whenever he let his hands down, Amalek prevailed. The entire momentum of the war literally rose and fell with the sheer exhaustion of Moses' arms. Verse 12 is where we see some incredibly beautiful practical teamwork. Moses' hands were heavy, so Aaron and Hur took a large stone and put it right under him so he could sit down. Then they stood on either side of him, one on the right, one on the left, and physically held his hands up in the air. I love this. They didn't just pray for him, they provided practical, physical reinforcement. And because of this vital support, Moses' hands remained perfectly steady until the sun went down. As a direct result of this teamwork, verse 13 tells us Joshua was able to discomfit or completely overcome Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Following this hard-fought victory, verse 14 gives Moses another set of clear instructions. The Lord commands Moses to write this event down in a scroll or a book as a permanent memorial and to rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. Why? Because God makes a profound vow here. He declares that he will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. This unprovoked, predatory attack on a weak and weary people was deeply offensive in the biblical text. It was something God would not forget or forgive. To solidify this promise and really honor God for the victory, verse 15 says Moses builds an altar. He calls the name of it Adonai Nissi, which translates to "the Lord is my banner." In verse 16, Moses declares that because hands were lifted up to the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. It's a powerful final statement of ultimate reliance on divine protection, signaling to everyone that the battle wasn't just Israel's, but it was truly God. So, the crucial point is Section 4, Key Ideas and Lessons. Okay, so we've walked through the narrative text verse by verse, but our explanation really isn't complete until we extract the practical applications of these verses. First, we learn a really hard lesson about facing hardship without losing faith. When the Israelites lacked water, their immediate human default was pure panic. They tested God out of fear, rather than trusting the God who had just miraculously delivered them from Egypt. It really shows how quickly we can forget past miracles when we're faced with present discomfort. Second, we see the absolute necessity of asking for help. And third, we see that true leadership requires a support system. Even an incredible, God-chosen leader like Moses couldn't win the battle alone. His human arms grew tired. He literally needed a physical rock to sit on, and he needed loyal friends like Aaron and Hur to hold his hands up to secure the victory. We all need our own Aaron and Hur when we're facing our biggest battles. And honestly, we must be willing to be an Aaron or a Hur for others.
Let's move to and see how this builds. Section 5, Chapter Recap and Conclusion. So just to briefly recap our timeline, we began with the Israelites facing a severe physical crisis in verse 1, that intense thirst at Rephidim, which we saw quickly escalated into a spiritual crisis of doubt, anger, and striving. We then saw God's miraculous provision of water from the rock at Horeb, permanently marking the place as Massah and Meribah because of their testing. Immediately after that, the sudden, unprovoked attack by Amalek forced the exhausted people into a fight for their very lives. And finally, we witnessed a profound victory achieved not just by Joshua's sword, but through the supported hands of Moses and the banner of God. So before we go, I really want you to ask yourself, when you hit your own wilderness moments and the resources dry up, do you strive and panic, or do you look for the rock of divine provision? And whose hands are you holding up in their time of battle? Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.